Please be seated. So church sanctuaries are good for a lot of different things, and as some of our young folks have found out over the years, it's also a good place to play tag. A few weeks ago, a few of our young people, a couple of whom are here this morning, decided that it was going to be a good time to kind of relive some old childhood memories, right? And have a little tag around the church. Well, me being who I am, couldn't allow them just to do that all by themselves, right? So I wandered into church after the 10 o'clock service as we were kind of cleaning up, and they were sprinting up and down the aisles, and I was about here at the front of the church when Caden, one of our young people, who was most of the way to the back of the church, looked at me and kind of gave me that look like, you can't catch me, right? And then he said, you can't catch me. Well, I can't let that go, right? So I blasted off at full sprint, and by the time I got about halfway to him, he reacted, his eyes as big as saucers, as he sees all 200 pounds of me charging at him at full sprint with priest robes on. He starts to turn and try to run, and he makes it around the corner before he slips and falls down, and I tag him, and he said, "Father, you are fast." What he did not see was how fast I got out of bed the next morning, right? So I felt like some thug from the mafia had taken a baseball bat to both of my legs. Now, I go to the gym and stuff, right? We walk, but without preparation, without preparing, that sprint did a lot of damage to my legs. Has nothing to do with the fact I'm almost 50, right? But preparation is important. Preparation matters. And the Lenten season is almost upon us. A week from this coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. And I don't know about you, but the season of Lent is one of those that can kind of slip by me sometimes. Things are busy, things are rolling in church life and in work life and in our family lives. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, Easter is upon us, and we look back on our Lent and we think, what did I really accomplish? Preparation matters in the spiritual life. And so this morning is just a little bit of preparation to help stretch our spiritual legs a little bit, to help get us ready to celebrate a meaningful and deep Lenten season together. If we're really paying close attention to these readings this morning, then we might catch a sense of two very different themes that pop up. I felt like a Baptist preacher as I read that gospel this morning, right? And I could see the body language and the looks on people's faces as I looked out at all of you as I'm reading these very challenging words from Jesus. This continues to come to us from Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus gives some ethical teaching to those who are gathered around to listen. But he elevates ethics to a level beyond what even Judaism had demanded of faithful people. And this elevation can sound pretty harsh to our ears, right? I kind of like the Jesus who lets the little children come on to him and, forgives me for everything that I've done. It's a little harder when we hear Jesus placing an actual expectation upon us, especially when it's worded so strongly as it is in this gospel. As we look at this, we see him teaching about murder, adultery, divorce, vow-making, and raising this bar of action so high. Do what is right, avoid what is wrong at any cost, including the cost of members of your body, and hold yourself even more accountable than religious people at that time held themselves. As we think about that lesson, we fall back to our first lesson from the book of Sirach that reinforces that theme. If you choose, you can keep the commandments, and to act faithfully is a matter of your own choice. He has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whichever you choose. Before each person are life and death, and whichever one chooses will be given. Yikes, right? If I stopped right there, we would have some great material for a fire and brimstone sermon that would get our hearts trembling with fear, prepped for a properly penitential Lent. But then, in the midst of those two readings, the church decides to put this reading from Paul. Why did they decide to do that? There are plenty of other places in the epistles you could have chosen something fire and brimstone-y to keep with the other two readings, but the church put this in instead. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. For we are God's servants working together. You are God's field, God's building. What's going on here, right? This is a little different theme than the other two. The other two that place this weight of expectation, but then Paul saying, you know what? God's in charge. This is God's business. It's not ours. How do we balance those readings? And how do we make sense of all of that put together? What's going on here? Am I responsible for my present and future life on earth and my eternal destiny? Is it all on my shoulders, or is it all decided by God ahead of time? Do I have free will, or don't I? As we get ready for Lent, as we start to stretch our spiritual legs out and get ready for this season of introspection and prayer, this is a critical question. And it's one that Christians have debated from the very beginning. Some Protestant theology focuses primarily on this question in the Reformation. And this question split Calvinists, who, thumbnail sketch, believe that 100% of everything is fully dependent on God and God's providence, that we don't have free will at all, that God has decided it for us. And Arminians, who followed a Dutch theologian named Arminius, who wasn't very happy with Calvin's idea of lack of free will. And so Arminius came up with a little modified strategy that said, you know what, actually, we do have free will and our choices matter. The fight actually didn't begin there. It began all the way back in the beginning centuries of the church, where some theologians believed that a small community that was an offshoot of the community of the disciple of John felt that since they had been infused with God's Holy Spirit through Jesus, they could do whatever they wanted to do. Right? Now, that didn't go over very well. And the early church very quickly sort of smashed that down, because that doesn't pass the common sense test, does it? Others saw the danger in that extreme and pushed in the other direction. Now, if you want a full history lesson about all this, you can see me at coffee hour. I suspect, from the looks on your faces, that you've probably had enough of that for now, right? We can go into exhaustive detail about the battles of the Reformation and free will and not, but let's focus instead on the lessons of our lives, right? I found that that's always more convincing for me, to pay attention to what I've discovered as I've tried to follow Jesus over the years and as you have tried to follow. If you believe that you are 100% in charge of your choices, that life and death have been set before you and you are responsible for consistently choosing life, then how's that working for you? Right? I'll tell you how it's working for me. It isn't. I've tried my entire life, right? I grew up as a Catholic kid, as some of you have. I've tried to check off the boxes and eliminate sin from my life and try to do good, and I am just about 50 years old, and I don't feel that I'm a whole lot better at that than I was when I first started Sunday school. I'm convinced now that the spiritual compass in my human heart is faulty. And honestly, if it were just broken, then at least I'd have a 50-50 chance of choosing what's right over what's wrong, right? Kind of a karmic coin flip. If I was completely blind in the heart, then I would just, a blind squirrel gets a nut every once in a while. I might just accidentally choose to do right, but you know what? I'm not even batting 500, I wouldn't say. So my human heart compass isn't just broken, it's actually pointing in the wrong direction, consistently trying to lead me off a cliff. And if it weren't for God and God's grace, I would gleefully jump off the cliff every single time. And I think if we're truly honest with ourselves, then we can admit that about ourselves. That when it comes to it, if we're on the parkway and someone cuts us off and almost rips the bumper off our car, our inclination is not to say, God bless you, peace be with you, right? We know what our instant impulse is. And that's just one small example. Constantly, we battle that pull of the world, that pull to jump off the cliff, to ignore God's command of love and instead choose what our little selfish hearts want. We want security, we want peace, we want things to be ordered, we want things to be our way. And when it's not, we have a hard time with it. So as we mine our own experience, I think as we spend more time being introspective and thinking about our lives, we can understand that. Now, at the same time, that doesn't bring us discouragement, because we know that even though this is broken, our God is not. And we find our encouragement and our strength in that. But how exhausting to think that you would have to constantly choose to be saved and yet feel so powerless to actually do it. At the same time, though, our choices are real, aren't they? As we mine the experience of our lives, we know that choices matter. That's a lesson our lives teach us, right? This isn't fancy theology. This isn't debates between old white guys with beards and funny hats that died 500 years ago. I've seen human actions, human choices result in life and death. I've seen my actions, my choices result in life and death. My choices matter, your choices matter, and God is sovereign. God is in charge. Both of these things are true, I think, and they don't have to cancel each other out. In fact, I think if we put them together and find that place of virtue in between them and amongst them, it gives us a place to aim our efforts this Lent. This coming season is not about eradicating sin from our lives, because guess what? We cannot. And truth be told, we usually don't even want to. It's about drawing closer to the ever-present, ever-loving God in Jesus, the one human being who has ever lived, whose heart pointed in the right direction. This season is not about feeling guilty. It's not about striving harder. It's not about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's about drawing closer to the one who can actually change us, to the one who can actually change the world. So this Lent, even if we don't feel up to it, if we don't feel that this is the right time for us or a good time for us, let's ask God's Spirit to encourage us, to lift us up and bring us to that place where He desires us to be, a place of love, mercy, and compassion, each day drawing closer and closer to His heart.